Hi guys, in this video we're going to be learning how to calculate a percentage of a whole number. Now, to do this effectively you're going to need some prior knowledge. First of all, it's important that you have a good understanding of the relationship between fractions, decimals and percentages. The other thing that you'll need a good understanding of is how to calculate fractions of a whole number. And lastly, you will need to know how to simplify fractions. Now, I've already done videos on each of these topics, so if you haven't watched them yet, go back and have a watch of them first. But if you're familiar with all of those areas, then let's crack on with how to calculate percentages of a whole number. So a percentage is just a fraction out of 100. So if I take a whole number and then split it into 100 parts, I am working out a percentage of that whole number. So if my whole number is 100 and I split 100 into 100 parts, then one part would be 1%. So 1% of the number would be 1. 2% of the number would be 2. 50% of the number would be 50. Where it gets trickier is where we are taking other whole numbers that are not 100. So if we take the number 36 here, to work out any percentage of it, we have to split it into 100 parts, and then if we're wanting to work out 10%, we have to work out what 10 of those parts would be. If we're wanting 20%, we have to work out what 20 of those parts would be. So percentages basically involves a little bit of division and a little bit of multiplication. But the key to remember, the easiest way to remember this, is that all percentages are just fractions out of 100. So if you can work out fractions, you can work out percentages. So we're going to start off fairly simply here. We're being asked to work out 50% of 20. Now, as I said already, all percentages are just fractions. So when I see 50% of 20, I don't think 50%, I think 50 hundredths. So what I'm really being asked is, what is 50 hundredths of 20? Now, fractions, they can be simplified. So when I see 50 hundredths, I don't want to work out 50 hundredths. Work out 50 hundredths of this number, I would have to divide it by 100 and then times it by 50. That's way too complicated. Instead, I'm going to simplify that. I'm going to make this a simpler fraction. So 50 and 100 can be simplified. They're both in the 50 times table. So I can simplify 50 hundredths to a half. So what I'm really being asked, when I'm being asked 50% of 20, is, what's half of 20? And that's a way easier problem. All I need to do is divide by the bottom number. I divide by 2. So the answer is 10. So our steps to this then, our steps to success, was 1, to write it as a fraction. 2, to simplify that fraction. And then 3, work out the fraction. So calculate the fraction of the number. If we follow those steps, we'll always get the right answer. So instead of writing it as a percentage, write it as a fraction, simplify it if you can, and then just treat it as any normal fraction. So let's apply this thinking to the next problem. We're being asked 25% of 28. So, steps then. Write it as a fraction. 25 hundredths of 28. Okay, I'm starting to think about this. I could divide it by 100 and times it by 25. That would be one way of doing it. And you know what? If I had a calculator, that'd be pretty easy. I could do that, no problem. But Haven't got a calculator, need to do it in my head. So instead what I'm going to do is simplify it. 25 hundredths, I could divide it by 5, divide it by 5 again. What I get is a quarter. So what this question is really asking me is, what's a quarter of 28? Well, that's easy. I can do that. All I have to do is divide by 4. A quarter is when we divide it by 4. So how many 4s are in 28? We have 7. Again, knowledge of division is really, really important for this. If we have a good knowledge of our times tables, a good knowledge of division, this is a piece of cake. So again, following the steps, write it as a fraction, simplify it if we can, and then work out what that fraction of the whole number is. So 25% of 28 is 7. Got just 2 more examples now. So we're being asked here, what's 10% of 90? Well, 10% is 10 over 100, 10 hundredths of 90. The percentage is always over 100. That is what percent means, out of 100. Simplifying that, well, these are both in the 10 times table, so it's going to be a 10 of 90. So using my times tables knowledge, how many 10s are there in 90? 9 of them. So my answer, a tenth of 90 is 9. Now for this final example, little bit trickier, but by no means impossible. 75% of 32. So 75% is 75 hundredths. So I'm being asked what is 75 hundredths of 32. I could divide by 100 and times by 75. So 32 divided by 100, get my answer, times it by 75, and that would work. But instead, I'm going to stick to the formula, I'm going to simplify. Now, I can simplify this in lots of different ways. I could start off trying to divide it by 5. I could then divide it by 5 again. Slowly figure out where I'm going with that. However, it's a little bit easier if I know my 25 times table. So I'm going to do my 25 times table up to 75 and up to 100. So it goes 25, 50, 75. That was 3 stations to get to 75. And then 25, 50, 75, 100. That was 4 stations to get to 100. So 75 hundredths, or 75%, is 3/4. So what I'm really being asked is, what's 3/4 of 32? Now, I'm going to break down my thinking a little bit more here. What I'm really being asked is 32 divided by 4, and then take my answer and times it by 3, because I divide by the bottom, which is what I'm doing here, dividing by 4, get my answer, and then times by the top, times by 3. So 32 divided by 4, let's sort out this section. 32 divided by 4 is 8. But now I need to times that by 3. 8 times 3, 24. So 75% of 32 is 24. And again, this makes sense. 25% of a number is only 1/4 of that number. So 75% is going to be 3 times as big. In fact, it's going to be most of the number. And if we think about it, 24 out of 32, 24 is almost all the way there. It's 75% of the way there. And so that makes sense. So our strategy, again, just to refresh, was 1, to write out the percentage as a fraction, as we did here. 2, to simplify the fraction, as we did here. And then 3, calculate the fraction as normal by dividing by the bottom and then timesing by the top. There we go, guys. Cheers.